Last minute flex rankings with as much injury news as we can possibly get. I don't need to talk about tier 1, tier 2. Honestly, I don't even need to talk about tier 3. If you have them, you start them. Yes, I know some people in the live streams have been panicking with A.J. Brown. He's going to be just fine. Go ahead and play him. Now, starting off with tier 4, we are going to be looking at Mr. Courtland Sutton. With Sutton, you can make a very strong argument that he should be right up there with A.J. Brown and Tyreek Hill a tier above. This is a receiver that, while yes, he may not necessarily be a top 5 option in total points scored this season, he is, for the first time ever, actually turned into a real wide receiver 1. He is the wide receiver 12 in total fantasy points scored. And if you look at what we have seen since the emergence of Bo Nix, really, I would say the first game that Bo Nix, quote unquote, took over and broke out was the New Orleans Saints contest in week 7 on Thursday night. Since then, weeks 8 through 13, you actually have Sutton averaging almost 10 targets a game. You have Courtland Sutton averaging about 80 to 90 receiving yards per game and has had the worst game during that stretch at 14.8 fantasy points. The dude's a stud. Not worried about the matchup against Indy. Very easy start. Terry McLaurin, yet again, another receiver that y'all know we made a lot of money fading back a couple years ago. But this season, he actually does turn into a true wide receiver 1 in fantasy football for the first time ever. With Terry McLaurin, while yes, you've had a couple down performances so far this season, I mean, if you remove the first 2 weeks, you've only had one game with fewer than 10 fantasy points for Scary Terry. Now, the target volume isn't exactly there. You only have one contest with 10 or more targets. But of course, the efficiency is with Jaden Daniels, who's just been great this season. And again, I'm not super concerned about the matchup against the Saints. We have an implied team total of 25 points. So the reports right now, as of Friday night, are saying that Breece Hall is going to be playing this Sunday. Now, with Breece, obviously he did not play this past week. Not only that, but Breece did not practice on Wednesday and Breece did not practice on Thursday. So am I going to come through and rank him ahead of running backs like, say, I don't know, maybe Chuba Hubbard? Probably can't at this point, right? Because you do fundamentally have some concerns about his overall playing time, and maybe if he does see just a little bit of a split between him and Braylon Allen. But in a really good matchup against a really bad Jags team, where you actually do have the Jets favored in this game, and we know Breece does give you a receiving floor, you still probably start Breece, but it's hard to put him in the same range as what you have with those other running backs, such as Chuba Hubbard, James Conner. Looking at Jonathan Taylor, I've seen a lot of people in the live streams really stressing on if they should start him or not. There are very few running backs in the NFL in today's age that are going to see legitimately 100% of the opportunities out of their own backfield. Looking at Jonathan Taylor on Underdog at the moment, he is currently higher lower 19.5 rushing attempts, which you would typically say, oh my gosh, that's a really high mark. I mean, it's an easy spot to take the lower in a game where they are dogs against the Denver Broncos. But then you look at Jonathan Taylor and go, well, okay, over the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 games, you've only had 2 games with fewer than 20 carries. Now, of course, with Anthony Richardson under center, the receiving usage isn't going to be through the roof. We know A-Rich isn't going to check the ball down very often, but still, Jonathan Taylor is a running back that you have to start absolutely every single week. I know it's been frustrating. This past week, you end up getting the 103 total yards. And really, I think where most people are upset is the touchdowns just simply haven't been there, where you only have 2 touchdowns over the past 6 games. But again, he is almost at even odds to score a touchdown on Underdog again this week. Going over looking at Rico Dowdle. Dowdle at this point has turned into an absolute must-start running back. Now, on paper, this is a phenomenal matchup going up against the Carolina Panthers, where the Panthers have allowed the most fantasy points to opposing running backs so far this season. Maybe a little bit trickier this week, however, because you actually do have the Carolina Panthers favored in this game over the Dallas Cowboys. So with that in mind, you may actually see the Panthers be able to push the aggressiveness from this Dallas offense in the second half, forcing Cooper Rush to drop back and forcing them to skew away from the run. where in the past 3 weeks, that really hasn't been the case. Dallas has won 2 of the games over the past 3 weeks. And obviously it was a very close contest against Cincinnati here, where in those 3 games, you did have Rico Dowdle just coming in with at least 20 opportunities every single week. He is currently higher lower, 100.5 total yards on Underdog, which I personally find very, very aggressive, but it's understandable because of the opportunity that he's been given. Plus, it's a good matchup on paper against the Panthers. Now, Aaron Jones will be our next back. With Aaron Jones, it is encouraging to see that he pretty much had everything in this backfield against the Atlanta Falcons this past week. Now, obviously, Sam Darnold just completely takes over the game. It's an offense that goes out there, and they really just throw it over and over and over again. So we don't get a ton of rushing volume for Aaron Jones, but it looks like you're not having to be as concerned about the fumble issues that you saw in week 13. It's a matchup here against Chicago where they are very heavily favored by about a touchdown. So you wouldn't be surprised at all if you actually see the 22 rushing attempts that you had from Aaron Jones back in week 12, yet again this week against the same Chicago Bears team. Now going over and looking at Rashad White, clearly this ranking is us operating under the assumption that you have no Bucky Irving this week. Bucky Irving did not practice pretty much at all. So with that in mind, I think things are trending towards Rashad White being the lead back in Tampa. Full transparency, I have Rashad White in a decent amount of underdog drafts, so yours truly is really hoping that Rashad White comes through in a big time way because this is the playoffs. This is the time when it really does matter. 2 drawbacks. You do have a tough matchup going up against the Los Angeles Chargers. And realistically, I do think you probably see Sean Tucker involved here a bit. But this past week against the Raiders, Rashad White actually did see a season high 76% of the snaps, while at the same time, he had 20 opportunities. Now, Ladd McConkey has not officially been cleared for this game yet, but I am operating under the assumption that Ladd's probably going to be good to go. He was extremely close to playing this past week against the Kansas City Chiefs. Get another week to recover. He's been at practice. It's a phenomenal matchup going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Right now, he is higher lower 75.5 total yards on Underdog. I think a lot of this has to do with the matchup. But honestly, there is an argument to be made that I should just go ahead and I should put Jerry Jeudy ahead of Ladd McConkey. Now, officially, you have no Cedric Tillman yet again this week. Looking at Jerry Jeudy, this is a receiver that's over the past, say, 6 games that you've had with Jameis Winston, has seen 79, 73, 142, 85, 235, and then 64 receiving yards. This matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs is one in which you probably assume that you actually do have Jameis having to drop back to pass very often. We're going to assume that the Kansas City Chiefs win this game favored by about 5 points. Jerry Jeudy currently is higher lower 73.5 receiving yards on Underdog. And if David Njoku misses this game as well, I am super interested in taking Jerry Jeudy to go higher than 73 receiving yards with no Tillman, with no Njoku, where he's been getting there most weeks so far this season. Really, the only times that we haven't seen it with Jameis under center is when you had that really tough matchup, of course, against the Pittsburgh Steelers. But of course, if you wanted to check out any of the pick'ems for this weekend, you can do so over there on Underdog Fantasy. Underdog's available in damn near every state. It's in Texas, it's in California, it's in New York, it's in Florida. Yes, it's probably in your state. And if you use code FLOCK, you're going to get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you're going to be getting a free Jordan Love pick, more than less than half a total yard for this Sunday game. Now, going over to our next receiver, we are going to be looking at T. Higgins. T. Higgins, you do get a little bit of a drop-off this past week against the Dallas Cowboys. I know a lot of people were upset. I know a lot of people were playing T. Higgins and trying to get the bye week in week 15. Higgins flops. Can't deny that. But underlying this, you have a large sample of T. Higgins really dominating so far this season. I mean, if we remove the first week back from injury back in week 3 against Washington, you had seen 12, 29, 15, 18, 30, 18, and 4 fantasy points. So really only one really disappointing performance in a game in which Jamar Chase goes for 45 plus points. Now, somebody who's sitting with the first round bye because of Jamar Chase, thank you, Jamar. Realistically, we can't expect Jamar Chase to have that kind of market share in this Bengals offense forever in the future. Now, Brian Robinson is in a very interesting situation. This is a game in which you actually see the Washington Commanders heavily favored against the New Orleans Saints. You had Brian Robinson in week 13 with only 47% of the snaps, seeing the 103 rushing yards and the rushing touchdown. And I will be honest with you, one of my favorite pick'ems on Underdog this week is actually a little bit sneaky. It's going to be for Brian Robinson to go higher than 4.5 receiving yards. A big reason for this is while, yes, this is a team that does have some depth at the running back position, with no Austin Eckler in this backfield, I think we can assume that Brian Robinson does have some receiving involvement. He's had at least 4.5 receiving yards every single week this season since week 3. So I think that is interesting. The only hesitation you have with it, of course, is the Commanders probably can just run the ball over and over and over again, and you probably don't see a ton of Jaden Daniels dropbacks. Now, our next option is going to be James Cook. If you are looking at James Cook, this is a running back that had a very disappointing week in week 14, where you come through with the 6 touchdowns for Josh Allen, and James Cook does not even hit 5 fantasy points. It's a really tough matchup as well going up against the Detroit Lions. However, if you do take a step backwards and look at the larger sample this season, despite James Cook missing a game back in week 6, you actually still have James Cook as the RB14 in total fantasy points off of very limited volume. But because James Cook is in one of the best offenses in the league, and this game environment has an over-under of 55 points, so there should be a ton of opportunities for touchdowns. Now, going over and looking at our next options, we're going to have Devonta Adams, Garrett Wilson back-to-back. Really good matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars. You actually have decent projections here with the New York Jets this week. Now, of course, you do have the concern that you could potentially end up seeing the Jets go through and run the ball consistently if they are able to get to an early lead against this Jags team. With Adams, he has been by far and away the best receiver over the past month in New York. But again, Garrett Wilson still has a ton of target volume. I mean, if you're looking at Garrett Wilson over the past 4 weeks, he is still sitting here averaging 8-9 targets a game. So realistically, you probably want to play both guys. And going over and looking at Isaiah Pacheco, this is a running back that has a whatever matchup against Cleveland, where it's not like this is a spot that you dream about. But of course, the Kansas City Chiefs are favored in this game. You're operating under the assumption that when the Chiefs are ahead, at least what we have seen so far this season, is they are willing to go out there and they're willing to just run the ball over and over and over again. You have the expanded role from Pacheco from weeks 13 to 14, going from a total of 8 opportunities up to 18 opportunities. I expect to see the snap rate continue to rise for Isaiah Pacheco in this offense, while at the same time, I'm not going to be surprised whatsoever if you get 20 plus opportunities. So can we just go through and pencil in Pacheco for 20 plus points? Probably not, but I do think that he is a very interesting start, even if he's been disappointing over the past 2 weeks. Jackson Smith-Njigba, we're officially crowning as the wide receiver 1 in Seattle. It has only taken 6 straight weeks of JSN leading the Seattle Seahawks in total fantasy points for us to do this. I don't know if DK Metcalf's just hurt. I don't know what's going on with Metcalf. Thank God I don't have to worry about starting this bum this week. But I don't know. If you all looking at JSN, I don't think you can just crown him as a wide receiver 1 right this second, where over the past 3 weeks, you're looking at a player that's averaging about 5 to 6 targets a game. Zay Flowers will be our next call. With Flowers, you actually have the Baltimore Ravens projecting to be the highest scoring offense in the NFL. However, you do have a 15-16 point spread on this game. So it's probably one in which they are just going to be running the ball over and over and over and over again with Derrick Henry. So I don't necessarily know how excited we can be to go ahead and just jam in Flowers, where the overall passing volume in this offense probably is just a little bit capped. Jakobi Meyers is a receiver that over the past 5 weeks has had 4 games with 10 or more targets. But the issue that you're going to have here is you have a decimated quarterback room and arguably now the worst quarterback play in the NFL. Now with Meyers, the target volume is there. It's not like he's had great quarterback play at any point this season. While at the same time, you do have a really strong matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. I think I'm more excited about Meyers in a full PPR league than a non-PPR league because, of course, in that non-PPR format, you are pretty much just going to be chasing the touchdown upside. And while we want to say Meyers in a garbage offense, he does have an implied team total about 19.5 points, which is much higher than what we're going to talk about with some of these other offenses soon. Jaylen Waddle coming off a pretty big performance, 20 points this past week. We go back 3 weeks ago, get to 28 points. So we are seeing signs of life. Now, I will be a little bit hesitant here and at least point out that typically what we have seen so far this season is when Tua's under center here in Miami, unless it's a really cold game, you actually do have Tua coming through and projecting out with an implied team total for this offense of 25, 26 points as a borderline top 5 unit every single week. However, this week, you actually do have the implied team total down only at about 22.5 points with lowered expectations for this Dolphins offense. I think maybe Waddle's a little bit less exciting than he would have been a week ago. Brian Thomas, Malik Nabers will be our next 2 receivers. Just on record, I think Malik Nabers is a significantly better talent than a lot of the players ranked ahead of him here. I think if we are just ranking these guys off talent, Nabers is 10 times better than Waddle, Myers, Flowers, JSN. I think he's better than Wilson, Adams, Higgins, Jerry, Ladd. You can go on and on and on. I think Malik Nabers is one of the best receivers in the league. And I can say Brian Thomas is great as well. The issue is the offenses. You have Brian Thomas and the Jags projected out to be a bottom 3 offense this week with their implied team total of 18 points. And again, Malik Nabers and the New York Giants, and you'll see with Tracy being ranked this low, not only project to be the worst offense in the league, but they project to be the worst offense in the league by a country mile. You have an implied team total of 14 points this week. So I can't sit here and say like, oh, okay, well, we want to rank Nabers ahead of Brian Thomas because they're both in bad offenses, but I think Nabers a little bit better because while Brian Thomas is in a bad offense, it still projects to be significantly better than the Giants. Like if you're looking at just sportsbook projections right now, the gap between the Giants and Jags is the same gap between the Jags and the Dolphins in points scored this week. Jordan Addison will be our next receiver. Now, I don't have Addison in the Flock League, but I do have Addison as my most drafted receiver on Underdog this year. And one of the big reasons why we are absolutely crushing Underdog drafts, I know we didn't say this in a live stream just yet, but I actually advanced 41 sprint Underdog teams. I think the most in the world. Like we are absolutely crushing Underdog this year. And a big reason for that is Mr. Addison. Thank you very much. 39 points this past week. I really hope he continues to crush it. We stand to make a lot of money if he does. This matchup against the Chicago Bears is one in which Chicago is probably not going to be able to keep up. Wouldn't be surprised at all if we actually do see the passing volume a little bit muted. But again, last time they played Chicago, you did have 30 points for Addison. So I'm really hoping we get the touchdown and this continued hot streak. I'm looking at Tony Pollard. It is difficult to know if he is 100% good to go or not. Obviously, this is going to be an injury that you have to keep on monitoring. This past week, you did have 23 opportunities. We've seen some receiving involvement, of course. And the main thing is, it's just going to be a phenomenal matchup here going up against the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, going over and looking at Adam Thelen. With Thelen, I apologize. We did not rank him in the rest of season rankings. That was a mistake. We've updated that over on flockfantasy.com. But over the past 2 weeks, he's had over 200 receiving yards. And this past game against the Philadelphia Eagles, I actually thought Adam Thelen was an absolute trap. Because if you were looking at the projections that you had in Carolina, sportsbooks were projecting the Carolina Panthers to be a bottom 3 offense in the league. And I was going, okay, well, I don't want to start Thelen, even if he's coming off the 24-point game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But while Bryce Young only had about 160 passing yards, which obviously is abysmal for any receiver in the offense, Adam Thelen had about 102 of those receiving yards. So Thelen with an absolute monster market share rate here in this Panthers offense. And the Panthers project out significantly better this week against the Dallas Cowboys in comparison to what they did a week ago against the Philadelphia Eagles. So I think Adam Thelen is an easier start this week than he was last week. Obviously, if you started him last week, congrats. Now going over to DJ Moore. With DJ Moore, again, I want to reiterate, he's the wide receiver 1 in Chicago. No, a lot of people got upset with us ranking him about this range. Last week? Yeah, he had the 2 great games against Minnesota and Detroit, but those were 2 weeks where Caleb had about 600 passing yards. So again, you're not expecting Caleb to be at the top of the NFL in passing volume. I expect this to be a low volume offense. They currently project to be a bottom 5 offense in total points scored this week. But last time, yeah, DJ Moore going up against Minnesota, he did go through and drop 27 fantasy points. Now, DK Metcalf, I don't know why I traded for this dude. The most embarrassing thing ever is earlier in the season when Metcalf was banged up. I was like, okay, I have a playoff team. I just need to think about long-term upside. I traded Devonta and Lad McConkey for DK Metcalf and I want to say Najee Harris. I thought I got a win. People in the league said I got a win. And of course, what we see since DK Metcalf comes back from his injury is this dude's just a freaking turd. 14, 9, 10, and 9 fantasy points over the past 4 weeks. JSN has just been absolutely dominating him. The last game that you had 20 plus fantasy points for Metcalf was back in week 3. Now, with all that being said, it's a decent game environment going up against Green Bay, where Seattle should probably have to throw the ball a decent amount. But I don't know. It's just been so disappointing here. Marvin Harrison is a receiver that over the past 2 weeks has actually seen 20 targets. This is the most heavily has been targeted in a 2-week span so far this season. And you go back to week 13 where this coaching staff came through and they said, yeah, Marvin Harrison is now going to be the focal point of our offense. Plus, you actually have seen the snaps be up since the bye. So across the board, seems like Harrison is getting used more in this offense, while at the same time, you actually do have really good projections here for this Arizona Cardinals offense going up against New England with an implied team total about 25.5 points here. Now, Jameson Williams is a receiver that y'all know I was saying to sell high early in the season. Wasn't a big believer. Thought, okay, well, he's a boom bust, a receiving touchdown option where if you have the long touchdown, he's going to be great. If it's not there, he's going to be a turd. But Jameson's actually been pretty damn good over the past month. I mean, over the past month, Jameson Williams has averaged 7 targets, which of course 7 targets isn't great, but it's a hell of a lot better than the floor that you had earlier in the year. And if you're just getting 7 targets, at the end of the day, you have additional opportunities to get that long receiving touchdown. And this is a game against the Buffalo Bills in which we have a 55-point over-under, the highest projection we've seen from any game so far this season. So if there was ever a week to start Jameson Williams, I think it's the week where you actually probably do have a considerable amount of Jared Goff dropbacks. And I think it's this one. Now, Calvin Ridley is also an interesting play here where Calvin Ridley gets to go up against the Cincinnati Bengals. Ridley obviously has bad quarterback play, but the Bengals are the worst defense in the league. So you actually have an implied team total of 21 points here in this Tennessee Titans offense, which obviously is more than what you're going to see with the Chicago Bears, which is way more than what you're going to see with the New York Giants, the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Raiders. So we do have some of these other players that are ranked in bad offenses ranked ahead of Ridley. He had the 12 targets this past week, while Nick Westbrook-Ikhines scored the majority of the fantasy points over the past 2 months in Tennessee. Calvin Ridley's had the majority of the targets, and y'all know I am always one to go with the targets rather than the unsustainable touchdown rate. Now, Devonta Smith is in a really tough spot going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, where again, Smith has not seen more than 7 targets since back in week 3 this season. So I have Smith in the flock league. This is going to be somebody that I'm having to stress on if I'm going to start him in week 16 or not. I would say here this week against the Steelers, probably not the most exciting play in the world. I'm looking at Darnell Mooney, up and down receiver where you really haven't had the passing touchdowns here in Atlanta. So we've had some of these down performances where in week 13, you only get the 5 fantasy points, obviously get banged up in week 11. But you do have an implied team total about 24.5 points here for the Falcons this week. So sportsbooks are telling us that we should get a bump up from the play of Kirk Cousins. Now going over to the gross running backs with volume tier. Technically, Ramondre Stevenson is a starter, but he's in an offense that's probably not going to be able to run the ball a ton because the Cardinals are heavily favored here. So I don't know how excited we can be about Ramondre. Also, this is a receiver that has had 1 game with more than 21 receiving yards this season. So the receiving volume's not really there. Najee Harris is not in a good matchup at all going up against Philly. This is another player I have in the flock league. Thank God I don't have to start him this week. It's about the worst matchup that you could possibly ask for against the Eagles, where you actually do have Najee Harris with the lowest implied team total of any game we've seen from the Steelers this year with 18.5 points. DeAndre Swift hasn't been a practice all week. I don't even know if DeAndre Swift's going to play. Even if he does, garbage matchup. Tyrone Tracy, yes, will have volume and will be the starting running back here. But again, going back to what we're talking about with the Giants, this isn't just the worst offense in the league. This is the worst offense in the league by a country mile. this week. Now, our last tier will be the receivers that you can start and hope for a touchdown. Josh Downs, obviously, we've seen some pretty impressive weeks so far this season, but you are going to have, one, this is first game back, and two, at the same time, a pretty tough matchup going up against the Denver Broncos, and you have Anthony Richardson under center. Jayden Reed has had a few decent weeks with touchdowns, big plays. Really haven't been a believer in this dude, primarily because it's been all based off of efficiency, not really any underlying volume to support it. My favorite stat, which you've heard me say 1,000 times at this point, is you've seen one game this season with more than 6 targets for Jayden Reed. So if you're starting him, you're just hoping for the big play. Shakir had his first game of 20 fantasy points this season in week 14, but that was in a game in which you had no Keon, you had no Kincaid, and Josh Allen had 6 total touchdowns. With DeAndre Hopkins, the man still has not seen 60+% of the snaps in this offense over the past month, and he's had one game with 5 or more receptions over the past 5 weeks. Keenan Allen, up and down option in a low volume passing attack with serious competition. Amari, up and down option. Yes, he had 14 targets this past week, but again, you had no Keon, you had no Kincaid, and you had 6 passing touchdowns for Allen. Tank Dell, certified bum. Rome Odunze, maybe you get lucky and get a touchdown. And Elijah Moore is in play, considering the fact that you have no Cedric Tillman. Elijah Moore would move up these rankings dramatically over on flogfantasy.com if David Njoku does get ruled out as well. But I think that's all I got for you. I really appreciate you. And of course, if you wanted to tell us on Brian Robinson to have at least 4.5 receiving yards this Sunday, you can find that link to Underdog Fantasy in the description and the comment section. Code FLOCK will give you a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, at the same time, you're going to be getting a free Jordan Love pick, more than less than half a total yard for that Sunday game. And it is available in damn near every state. Yes, it's in California. Yes, it's in Texas. Yes, it's in Florida. Yes, it's in New York. But I really appreciate you and really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.